So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you. I hope that this podcast is a place where you can hear content that is interesting, relevant, and compelling, and hopefully something that you can act on. So that's what I'm trying to bring to you. I know that all of you listening today are busy people. I say this every week, but I mean it. You are doing things. I certainly appreciate the fact that you've tuned in. And today is actually a very, very important podcast, because we're going to talk about something which is very relevant in the news today. We're going to talk about puberty blocking and what that means, this whole transgender situation. And the person that is going to be my guest today is an author. He was at once a lawyer. He still probably has that skill, but he has segued into a next chapter in his life. He's now an author. His most recent book is called PHARMA, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America, published by Simon & Schuster, published in March of 2020. And I understand that is being made into a Showtime documentary. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But anyway, Gerald Posner, is such a pleasure to welcome you to the Hamilton Review.
It's great to be with you. I really appreciate you having me on and getting a chance to talk to your listeners. Thank you very much, Dr. Bob.
You're welcome. So listen, I always start my podcast by having my guests tell a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves, tell you a little bit of your story. I know a little bit of a tiny fraction of your story is pretty interesting. So the microphone belongs to you, Gerald.
I'm born and raised in California, in San Francisco. Grew up there, went to law school out there thinking that I wanted to be a lawyer, and then moved to New York to practice law. It took me only a couple of years to find out that law really wasn't my calling. Met my future and current wife there, Tricia. She was from London, and we've been together ever since. And I'm sort of everybody's favorite type of lawyer now. I'm a non-practicing one, but I took those talents of research and dedication and used it really to go into writing books, an unusual segue. And I've done everything from books on Nazi war criminals to books on how 9/11 happened. That got me banned from Saudi Arabia. I did a book on the kingdom. I've done books on political assassinations, history of pharma, money in the Vatican, you name it. I like going after stories that look like they're difficult to tell. And that's what prompted me to get into doing that piece that we'll talk about later about puberty blockers, the gender industry, and what's happening with young people in America right now.
And so I'll tell you what, let's get into it. So I came across Gerald's writing in the Wall Street Journal about a month and a half ago. He wrote an article called "The Truth About Puberty Blockers." And the subtitle is "The FDA hasn't approved them for gender dysphoria, and their effects are serious and permanent." So that caught my eye as a pediatrician. Obviously, this is where kids and culture collide, friends. And this is very much a hot topic. And I will tell you, I was sharing this with Gerald before we started taping here today, that I'm generally an upbeat person. I generally have a positive view about life. I have a lot of wonderful things that surround me, my family, my kids, my practice, living in California as well, Santa Monica, California. And so I have a lot of goodness in my life. But one of the things that really does grieve me in a deep, profound way is what's going on in this whole transgender world, and is something that I don't recognize, I don't understand, I don't recognize. And this article caught my eye, Gerald, because this is something that obviously has caused you a certain amount of consternation too. I can tell by your writing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it came to me, look, this first came up while I was doing the research on the book on the pharmaceutical industry. I have a chapter in there on off-label prescribing. As you well know, as a physician, the FDA in the late 1930s gives you the right as a doctor to take a medication that's been approved for a given purpose, has been tested, gone through clinical trials, and then you can use it for another purpose. Sometimes those other purposes, the off-label dispensing, become big hits for pharma companies. So originally, in a draft of the book that I had done back in 2018, 2019, I had some material about Lupron, which is AbbVie, the pharmaceutical company's big puberty blocker, and some other puberty blockers. That material eventually got cut out. And instead, I ended up talking about a high blood pressure medication that ended up using that had a side effect of growing hair. We know it very well. Or another high blood pressure medication that had the side effect of erectile dysfunction and became Viagra. Those off-label uses have become quite popular. When the FDA gave doctors that ability back in the late 1930s, there were a couple of dozen drugs approved. Now, as you know, there are hundreds and hundreds, and doctors don't have the same ability necessarily to be able to figure out what's happening. What is happening is, unfortunately, when it comes to gender and young people, there is sort of a train express that's rolling along that says, by the way, you can take a child 9, 10, 11 years old, right before puberty, and if they say and express the fact that they think they are the other gender, they're a boy, but they say, I think I'm a girl, or they're the girl and they say, I think I'm a boy, we have to give full credence to that. And we could put them on a medication that stops them from developing puberty naturally. And then if in 6 months or a year they still feel like they want to change their gender, we can start the process of medical treatments for hormones that might make them more toward the gender that they want to identify with.
So they call this gender affirming care, and I want to just take a second just to have you explain what that is, because this is something I find to be you're basically allowing the patient to make the diagnosis, and you kind of shepherd them along through the process. Explain to our listeners what gender affirming care really means.
You're absolutely right when you say we allow the patient to make the diagnosis. There's no other area in psychoanalysis or that in which somebody presents themselves as a patient in the office and they say, by the way, I'd like to say that I think that I have bipolar or I'm affected with schizophrenia, and the psychiatrist, the therapist automatically accepts that. But in gender affirming care, whatever the child says has to be affirmed. And let me tell you, we read about that term all the time. It's a term that it's only been in use for 10 years. Seems like it's been used a lot for something like that. And it came into the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the Bible, as you know, for psychotherapists. Sure. It's the Bible that sets forth all of the disorders and diagnosing any type of mental disorder or issue. So 10 years ago, for the very first time, in comes the expression of gender affirming care. And for the first time in history, it's applied to adolescents. So before, the idea of gender, transsexualism, whether somebody was going to change their sex, transvestism had always been an adult issue. Then all of a sudden in 2013, the DSM applies it to adolescents. And some countries in Europe, like the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, the most progressive of the countries, they start to experiment with the idea of not only saying to adolescents who express some doubt about their gender for 1 week, just like they say 1 week, I want to be Superman, another week, I want to be Supergirl. Now, if they say, I want to be a girl, they take it seriously. They started to experiment with the idea of giving hormone blockers, puberty blockers to children to see if they could actually pause puberty naturally and then be able to address this gender dysphoria, as they call it, in the future. No test, by the way, no clinical trials, nothing done in terms of the medicine, no testing done so that we know whether it's safe or not safe. The clinical trial was essentially done on children, tens of thousands of them across the world who have been subjected to this since 2013.
So these are, this is where it begins. It begins with a puberty blocker. So basically what you're doing is you're stopping the natural process. Obviously, the majority of the people listening to this show today have gone through puberty, and we remember that process. Well, that process is a natural process. If you're a boy, testosterone ramps up. If you're a girl, estrogen ramps up. And suddenly, boom, voila, you go through puberty and you become a young man and a young woman. You're essentially taking this medication, which is Lupron. And by the way, this is off-label. I want you to really clarify for people you kind of did, but off-label means that you kind of circumvent all of the normal rigorous diagnostic, testing, double-blind testing that they do for all the drugs out there, so many drugs out there. They kind of go end around on this one. It really explain what this really means.
It's really remarkable when you think that off-label, it's an extraordinary ability and power given to physicians in the first place. But when we're talking about children, you'd think that the FDA would even be more careful about it. By the way, some of your listeners may have heard of Lupron. They may have even used it themselves. Nothing to do with puberty or gender. But if any of your listeners have had prostate cancer, they may have been put on Lupron. I have an uncle who was on Lupron recently because it slows up the testosterone. It blocks it completely. It adds in an element of more estrogenic changes and slows up the prostate cancer. It's also approved for children for one area in which there have been clinical trials, and that's called precocious puberty. That's when children are developing, as you so well know as a pediatrician, puberty too quickly. Yeah. 6, 7, 8 years old too fast. It's given to slow that up. And guess what? In the application of that, they put a black box label on it, which is the FDA's biggest warning, because they realize that it can cause all types of side effects. They have over 10,000 adverse effect reports filed with the FDA from the application of precocious puberty, in which it's caused brittle bones cracking, suicidal ideation, problems with fibromyalgia and pain and chronic pain. And yet, it's now being given to healthy children to pause puberty without any clinical trials or studies having been done to see if it's safe. And our own FDA and National Institutes of Health, what do they say? Oh, no problem, because it's completely reversible. That's a lie. Yeah. It has, in fact, long-term and sometimes permanent consequences. And yet we have progressives who are saying to us, let's give it out like it's candy at a store.
So hold on, let me back up. So it's used for precocious puberty. You're absolutely right about that, which is a very rare phenomenon where kids develop. Basically, they become pubescent at, say, 8 or 9 years of age, and parents obviously don't want that, nor do we as doctors. We give them Lupron. So when it is given would be on label, not off label. I guess you'd call it on label appropriately. The black box is there for doctors to look at and say, but then when you give it off label, you're even exonerated from the black box. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, one of the things it's given off label for Lupron and other puberty blockers, just as a sidelight, is chemical castration of sex offenders. So, we're talking about a pretty powerful drug. It's not approved for sexual castration of sex offenders, but it chemically is used as a castration drug as well. Here's the problem, I believe, beyond the physical problems of what the side effects can be for children. Studies out of Britain show that over 90% of the children in the National Health System who were put on puberty blockers over a 6 to 7 year period went on to the next step, the next medical step in the gender industry. And the next medical step is we stop your puberty with puberty blockers. Now you're supposed to have a time in which you can say as the child and parents, oh, we agree or we don't agree with changing gender. Oh, by the way, excuse me, parents, they seem to be a bit of a problem because sometimes parents say no. So if you're really progressive, like the state of Oregon, just north of you, what do? You pass a new law which says at the age of 15, you can make your own decision as an adolescent to take puberty blockers and no parental consent is required. By the way, in that same state, you can't use a sun tanning bed unless you're 18 with a doctor's written permit and the consent of your parents. But if you want to go on puberty blockers, no problem at 15. So in some cases, we're putting the parents out of the situation. But in those cases in which parents are still required, we want to embrace it and then say, you're on puberty blockers, 90% go on to the next step, which is then what I call cross-sex hormones, which is we give to a boy estrogen so that they start to develop more female attributes, and to a girl we give them testosterone so they can start to develop some hair and a deeper voice box. Those are irreversible effects, by the way. We're not even at the stage of surgery, but we're talking about then hormonal effects that will have permanent consequences.
So let me just back up. And so I think I was aware of this Oregon law at 15 years of age. Can I just ask you a question? and I know how old you are, Gerald. When you were 15, what were you like? I mean, were
Oh
you?
my God, I think all the time. If there was social media or things like that, I'd look back at so many things at 15, 16, and 17 that at the time I thought I was just brilliant, and I looked like a total idiot for something that I thought was clever or whatever. Thank goodness I could never go out and get a tattoo or something permanent because I know that I would have hated it 10 times over. All those things that as children we think we're so convinced are right. And what happens, and you understand this so well as a pediatrician, you you look at 5 to 6 times the national average in terms of gender dysphoric children who are diagnosed as gender dysphoric, who have autism, who have increased rates of some depression. So we're taking children sometimes that might be a little bit on the spectrum, who may not always be the most popular children in the school, but the minute they identify as a new gender, they then become sort of a heroic figure. They become popular. People tell them how brave they are. If the parents are going along with that, I had a cousin who went through this in Northern California. They are reinforced by the system that they're on the right path. And the people, by the way, the children who have a difficult time are what I call the regretters, the detransitioners, those who later on say, oh, by the way, I made a mistake here. I was 15. I thought this is what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a different sex. I've gone through hormones and now my voice box is permanently changed, but I want to go back to what I was born with. And they sort of are pilloried, tarred and feathered by gender activists because they don't want to see regretters or detransitioners take place. It goes against the philosophy that we're creating a whole new world of non-binary people, no sexual identifications.
Yeah, there's no turning back, and if you do turn back, look out. Watch your backside. No, I think about how I was very vulnerable at 15 years of age. There were certain books I read. I remember reading a book, The Population Bomb, about that age, and I remember being terrified by that book. It was a book about the fact that we were heading, you probably read the book too, Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. And I remember reading that book and thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want kids. And the world is going to come to an end and we're all going to starve. And I was extremely, extremely impressionable. I look back now and realize, wait a second. We all those predictions that Paul Ehrlich with great erudition. I mean, his book was very readable. It was very compelling. I look back and kind of go, you missed it, Paul. You really missed it. And so I think about that, and I think about the milieu that these kids are growing up today. Unbelievable. And so we have this idea of, this watching and waiting has begun, watchful, what you say, watchful waiting. This is almost passé. It's like, oh, come on. It's like this. There's an arrogance that when you say, I think we're going to do a little bit of watchful waiting, people look at that and they mock you.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there's no question.
And so your thoughts about watchful waiting.
Right. Watchful waiting would be the process that any good clinician would think is necessary for a adolescent or a child who expresses some, uncertainty about their gender. You might wait for 6 months to a year and a half and see if that child feels the same down the road and nothing else has changed. It used to be, by the way, when they first had gender dysphoria and gender affirming care, and they talked about it as gender dysphoria as a symptom in the psychiatric manuals in 2013, you had to wait before that for 2 years before you could make a final diagnosis. In 2013, they changed that to 6 months. Now, 6 months, is that still followed? Absolutely not. I have cases in Sweden of 6 weeks from the time the child first goes in and identifies as a different gender to the time they start to give hormones. That to me is child abuse. And one thing to note, normally in America, we're behind the curve, it seems. The Europeans are a little bit further out there. In this case, we are ahead of the curve, and that's to our detriment. And what I mean by that is the countries like Finland and Sweden and Norway and others, the UK, which were embracing gender affirming care for adolescents and having the idea of puberty blockers for a long time, they've started to pull back. In 2020, Sweden did. In 2021, Finland did. Norway's now having a new look at it. The UK closed Tavistock, which was their main gender clinic, and they're having a reevaluation. And why? Because they all say, by the way, we should have realized this 10 years ago, there's no studies. We're not sure if these hormones and the blockers given for puberty are safe for the long term. Wow, please, you think that would have been the thing they would have said originally, but what's happening here? The professional association that you're a member of, the American Pediatric Association, the Endocrine Society, the American Medical Association, they've embraced the most progressive of these ideas. And I think that in 5 to 10 years, this is a prediction, I'm sure that'll be proven wrong in some way, that many of the medical associations are going to look back at this and wonder how they lost their way when it came to this issue on children for so long in the United States.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, I want to interject here. Just the reality that there have been historically very, very rare cases of gender dysphoria. Okay, and I will tell you that it's generally, I mean, if you look back on this, and I have done this research as well, that has been generally boys wanting to be girls, and extremely, extremely rare. And I ask people, parents all the time, I say, did you remember anybody when you were a kid who had gender dysphoria? Universally, the answer is no. Everyone I've ever asked the question to is been no. I never knew anybody like this. So the idea of girls wanting to be boys and really acting on that was almost zero. It really was. It approached zero. Boys, extremely rare. Girls, almost zero. Now we have this flipping of this whole thing, and now we have girls who are diving into this in a big way. They've outraced the boys on this, and I think you know that. And I'm concerned about what people are calling the rapid onset gender dysphoria, and I'm sure
Right.
Can you speak to that phenomenon?
So fantastic. So rapid onset gender dysphoria is an instance in which there's little doubt among the clinicians I've spoken to that there is a wave fed by social media, and in part, there's a contagion of gender dysphoria taking place among kids who think that it's trendy, cool, and in vogue to be able to identify as a different gender or put an X on your birth certificate. And in relation to that, rapid onset gender dysphoria is the idea that instead of truly developing, as you said, a gender dysphoria that's real, innate, and psychological, which might affect 0.001% of the population, children are identifying as gender dysphoric in a very rapid, fast time because of all the external influences that are used. This is a theory, not just a theory, but was put out by a few clinicians into a medical journal that's published by Springer, one of the large German medical publishers. And the pushback from gender activists was so strong that Springer took that article out. They retracted it. They took it out. They said, sorry, the information's not here for rapid onset gender dysphoria as of now, and we apologize for having published it. Meanwhile, it's very interesting. They never take out an article that promotes the use of hormones or puberty blockers, even though there is no study or scientific evidence to support the safety of those when it comes to adolescents and children. So we are undoubtedly, you're absolutely right, seeing an increase in absolute numbers. We're talking about tens of thousands only.